Hello, everybody. How's the monthly masterclass presented to you by Neurozone? I'm Etienne from Walt, CEO of Neurozone, a neurologist, and also co-founder. I've been involved with the Neurozone from the start. We are extremely passionate about the brain, neuroscience, and also neuroscience applications. In fact, we work from the basically in a field which is called now called behavioral or integrative behavioral neuroscience. And integrative behavioral neuroscience is really about using neuroscience, the understanding of the clinical of the brain-body system, and then integrating that understanding into the world that you and I know out there in the world of work, in the world of play, in the world of education, etc., etc. Because the brain-body system is an organism that's continuously learning, developing, performing, ensuring that we allocate resources to ensure that we stay alive, survive, and thrive in life, ensure that we also distribute those resources fairly, and so on. And so there's so much happening in that space of the behavioral, and what we have set out to do in the last 8 years is to really figure out what the behavioral code looks like if you really look at the brain-body system from a perspective of depth, if you look at it from the clinical, from the physiological, and of course, first and foremost, you have to understand how the brain-body system works, what the physiology is, and then what happens when things go wrong, and then build towards the functional by understanding what the organism does for us, and then, of course, what happens when things go right. And so stay alive, survive, thrive becomes the axis along which we operate, whether that is once again, in the world of business, in the world of education, sport, etc., etc. So without any further ado, I'm going to discuss a very important topic with you today. We are really all about resilience and the resilience for high performance. So we're going to speak about resilience and complex problem solving. And I hope to share a little bit with you around these two very important topics and demonstrate to you, while everything affects everything, how the synchronous dance is so important in resilience, and that deeply innate to resilience is complex problem solving and vice versa. In fact, I'm going to share a little bit of the understanding from the medical field with you as well, so we can understand something about how our brain-body systems work for us. Because innately to that, you'll find resilience and you'll find complex problem solving and innovation, which is not the same, but we are going to touch that as well. So I think it's a fascinating topic today. I hope you enjoy it as much as I'm going to enjoy it. I can't wait, but I'm going to start to share a slideshow that I prepared for you. Let me see if we can get there fairly quickly. Right. And so this dance between resilience and complex problem solving, or vice versa. This is a really topical issue today. As you know, in this rapidly evolving, VUCA, volatile, uncertain, complex, ambiguous world that we live in, where technology is really disruptive, but at the same time, we are also finding it incredibly important, but also challenging to leverage the diversity of the global village in which we live today. And of course, it's a great opportunity to enhance our capacity for resilience and complex problem solving. But at the same time, we are being challenged. We're being challenged by so many adverse events, uncertainty, that this challenge poses a great challenge to the brain-body system. And the field that I come from, the world of the clinical, where I saw many patients, I saw many patients who imploded, who developed brain-body system implosion because of chronic stress, and because effectively their resilience could not actually help them to overcome these onslaughts that were just coming one after the other. And of course, that then led to the whole system to implode and effectively challenged these individuals' lives, and some of them died. So it's really important to understand how important resilience is, not only for persistence or perseverance or tenacity and grit and all of those things, but it's an innate property. And I'm going to speak to that just now, and then I'm going to speak to complex problem solving, and then hope to put this together for you. So firstly, just a little bit of revision for those of you who have already been certified. We also have a number of our current students on the, if I may use the word students, coaches and HR professionals on the course, and I really welcome you as well, especially. So let me just share this very important slide with you again. When you think about the brain-body system and you think about Neurozone, you think about integrative behavioral neuroscience, you have to think about this field called psychoneuroimmunology. And let me just explain this in layman's terms. Psycho refers to behavior, the external world. We respond to the external, the ecosystem in which we live, that ether in which we receive information. We compare that information to an internal template, which is supposed to be very good for us to ensure that we avoid threats and maximize rewards. We unconsciously do that. It speaks a bit to mindset, of course, and worldview and belief system. And then with that information then leads to some kind of an action. And that behavior is either going to be an unconscious behavior to remove very imminent threats, and it's always going to lead to some feelings and thoughts, which can lead to give us longer time to make a higher energy, if you may, input decision as to how we will respond to this external environment. So the neuro refers not only to the psycho, the behavior, it also refers to how the brain works, the deep-seated structures within the brain, the way the brain responds physically to these challenges, the way that it needs to operate through rhythms and cycles, and continue to switch on and then go into a state where it replenishes, this whole idea of refueling and maintenance and so on. And if these two components in tandem, because it's all connected, if they don't work that properly, the body responds in a very fascinating way and very alarming too. It responds through the immunological system. There's also another specific field called psychoneuroendocrinology, which refers to the hormonal system. So it responds through a number of communicating networks. But the big communicating network that I want to share with you here is the immunological system, which leads to inflammation, so-called pro-inflammatory condition, a pro-inflammatory condition of your brain-body system, which then can lead to disease and death. And in time, it effectively erodes specific parts of your body, depending on where your genetic cracks are. And so you really want to be sure that this immunological system is kept at bay, that it doesn't actually respond through an inflammatory response, and that this psychoneuroimmunological axis is well looked after and really looks after you properly. And a lot of that is very dependent on this idea of the psychoneuro component, right? So we're going to spend quite a bit of time on that now. If you go back to this performance axis, the whole psychoneuroimmunological system works along this performance axis. If you have a bad psychoneuroimmunological system, you are in chronic stress, you start to implode eventually, but there's dysfunction and implosion. Now, many, I bet you probably know what percentage of individuals working in corporates today have chronic diseases. This doesn't mean that they have chronic stress, but there are many patients among those who have chronic stress and have been diagnosed with chronic disease. And there are many corporates, even more, who work without a chronic disease yet, but have chronic stress and is going to fall under this line in time. 30% of the large banks in South Africa have, at least that's one indication, have chronic stress. And I heard from colleagues in the US that that's very similar when you look at the numbers in these big corporates. So there's a lot going on in this space, especially in our work life. What you want to do is, if you want to perform at your best and have high performance, you need to be in a baseline relaxed physiological state. And that means that your psychoneuroimmunological axis looks after you properly. You prevent dysfunction. You then, on top of that, can optimize your brain-body system by actually looking after the most important components of your system. And I'm not going to go into that today because I really want to get to resilience and I want to get to brain performance. But by and large, if you prevent dysfunction, you optimize your system, you provide a platform for yourself. You set yourself up to perform at your best. And so you provide a platform for yourself for the acceleration of the mastery of your competencies and skill sets, of course, and that is critical because this is how you apply yourself within your workplace, and your clients apply themselves within their workplace through skill sets and competencies in certain fields and sectors of the industry. But by and large, this is all generic. This happens generically. That is specific to a particular individual and a group. So you can see how you can spiral up along this axis if you look after your psychoneuroimmunological process very well. And at the heart of that, at the core of this whole psychoneuroimmunological axis lies a very important innate biological property of living organisms. And this is called resilience. So resilience is an innate biological property. It is a property of course, not only of living organisms, but I'm going to explain resilience in living organisms just now. It's a property that is essential for life, for living. And in fact, we are here because our ancestors demonstrated and they had this property, which is called resilience. They had resilience, which allowed them to adapt to certain adverse events and ongoing processes that could have killed them. And they made use of whatever they developed, overcame these adversities, and then allowed them to then survive and even thrive in life as they continue to deliver offspring. And that's where you and I come from. So this whole property is something we need to understand very well. And it is that exact same property that organizations in organizational development and in leadership development now really deem so incredibly important. If somebody in your clientele or some of your coaches think about resilience as tenacity and grit, but not more than that, it's wrong. It's a mistake. It is not what it is. Resilience is way more than tenacity and grit, although tenacity and grit is also good to build resilience. But resilience is this innate property. So let me just share with you again this picture that you can see here. What you need to see if you look at this picture is this is what happens when the brain-body system becomes inflamed and then implodes and lead to disease. So what you see in the center here are the inflammasomes. They are these structures that are within the cells, they are formed within cells that respond to this particular attack. And this one here, the sterile attack is what we refer to. These are organisms and bacterial organisms and other viral organisms and so forth, which can cause similar problems. But this is a sterile attack which comes from this chronic stress state. The system that implodes, it says, I can't actually cope with this anymore. And then it leads to all these conditions around here. I'm not going to go through them, but you can see these are inflammation, chronic and acute inflammation. Over time, basically everything in your system can be affected. And just a little warning is that if you have, for example, type 2 diabetes, it doesn't mean that you had chronic stress which caused it. There are many other things, of course, that cause these conditions, but this inflammatory condition accelerates the onset of these conditions in your life by even decades. So it's very important to understand that. So having said that, I've scared everybody now, myself. We are very concerned. We understand that there's something here that if we don't look after ourselves properly, we will implode. But the good news is that at the same time, we can spiral up towards this complex problem-solving, innovative capabilities. And so let me just go to resilience then. So I selected this definition from one of the articles that I've been reading in preparation for the masterclass. So resilience has evolved somewhat from this Latin origin, I suppose this is resilire, which is translated as to leap back, to its current psychological related usage of having a protective effect, which is quite interesting because it means not only leap back, but this psychological related resilire also had a protective effect. And so in Latin, it was already understood that something protects us by leaping back, not staying in this zone where you have these adverse events coming your way, injuring you, wounding, and then terminally damaging us. But you actually have a way of leaping back despite these adverse events and then overcoming it through protection, which is an interesting concept because protection, this is the first, I think, very important differentiation or differentiator between resilience of an inert object like a piece of metal and the biological being. A biological being develops a protective effect, whereas an inert object like a metal will just bounce back. It just leaps back to its original state and it stays there. And then once the adverse event is removed, it will just stay in that original state that it was in before the adverse event was applied. That's resilience of an inert object, but you can see very interesting a few thoughts about this way that resilience here has been defined, at least in its origins. Let me just see if I can get to the next slide. So you can also see here what resilience is. This is the Neurozone descriptive definition of resilience. And you can see that we call this a capacity. I think it's important to understand that resilience does not give you any high performance. It doesn't give you something that sells for a value in the value chain. It really just gives you a capacity and sets you up so that you can perform at your best. I think that's very important. This is why we also don't focus at Neurozone on resilience only. Resilience is the bow tie for everything. But it's resilience for something. It's resilience for high performance or resilience for high performance leadership. Because resilience is a capacity of the brain-body system to prevent implosion in the presence of severe and prolonged stress. You can see it there. It prevents implosion, and then it bounces back. Once again, that's the leaping back after the stressor has subsided. But it also grows through stressful events to prepare the brain-body system for new and even unrelated stressors. This is really important. This is where the protective component comes in, right? So we grow through stressful events, and so we adapt to this condition, and we actually develop a stronger capacity to prepare the brain-body system for these are new related stressors, but it can also be unrelated. And this is incredible what the psychological system does. I'll give you an example of resilience in the body. It's a very simple example, but it's quite easy to understand. If you pick up weights, you do a bit of bodybuilding. So now you go and you do a bit of weights, and you actually take this bar, a dumbbell, and you just start working with the dumbbell, and it's a very heavy one. Then you have to overcome the challenge, which is gravity and the weight of the gravity and the weight that actually tries to pull your arm down. You have to overcome it with your strength. Then once you've absorbed that, you overcome it, and you have done that exercise for a while. You will not return to the same state, because tomorrow and the day after you're going to have some lactic acid, right? So something's happening in your muscle. So one is you overcame it. You actually prevented implosion. The second one is that now something happens, which means that you not only bounce back, but you start to grow. You grow a muscle. So a week later, you go to the same weight and you say, my goodness, this is actually quite easy. I've got a stronger muscle, and I can now even do something. I can actually now have a new and even overcome a bigger adverse event of the same nature. And so this is how resilience works in the physical. You can see what happens. You become a resilient being. I often show this one, for example, tree trunk at the beach house, which has got this interesting way that it became thicker at the point where there was a swing hanging. So this swing was hanging down on this trunk, and over the years, it had to work hard to maintain that particular swing with the little kids who became heavier on it. And so in time, it just developed this strong, big bark, that's actually quite thicker at this point. That's a very good example of resilience of a living organism, the tree. So having said that, in the psychological space, psychological resilience is way more important, if you may. It's actually something that's even different from this muscle or from the tree. It's something which also prepares us for even unrelated stressors. And the way that our brains do that is it starts to predict. It starts to predict, and it starts to compare with memory. And memory is the real thing here. So you and I have memory about events, and we have memory about associated potential events. And we start to build our resilience around more and more of potential adverse events, which is not only the one that is exactly the one that has come our way, which is quite interesting. Before I go here, I just want to take one step back and explain a little bit more about this resilience in the brain-body system. But at this point, I want you to focus a little bit on thinking how resilience and complex problem solving, this idea of performance, relates to each other and why they're so important for each other. Look at this. When I was a medical student, I studied homeostasis very extensively. We studied it in depth because homeostasis says something is always the same. It returns to the same state. In is out. It's a bit like money goes in, money goes out. Look at this example of homeostasis in the physiology of our system. Water, for example. We find this in drinking water, in food, and it all comes into the system. And the key organ here is the kidney that actually creates the urine, and it responds to, together with the brain, to ensure that we develop a sweating system, that we can get rid of the water by sweating. And of course, we breathe out a lot of water. So the idea that breathing and sweating and urine is all about the out and the in. What is interesting about them is that that out and that out equals that in. It's as simple as that. And so water in, water out is a good example of homeostasis, a very balanced process. So the physiology, the balancing act of the physiological system is a very important understanding, underlying premise, theme, underpinning theme, and a basic fundamental of how this dynamic system works. But what about allostasis? So what is allostasis? And I'm going to show to you, demonstrate how allostasis speaks to resilience. Look at this. I hope this is not too complex. It's quite complex for me. So I'm going to try to explain it carefully. What you see here is homeostasis. The first thing you have to understand of homeostasis is that there's a set point. That set point says water comes in, water goes out, right? And I sense it. So effectively, when I put in water, I take it in, I sense how much I've put in, and the effector says put exactly the same amount out. So the kidney, for example, senses it. The brain senses the information. All that information, and also in the blood vessels, senses the amount of water that comes in. There's a set point that says so much came in and so much must go out. The effector, which is now the kidneys and the skin and the breathing, gets rid of the water, and so you effectively have the controllable variable, which is the water, as now actually being dealt with very sensibly. But look at what happens when there's allostasis. The same thing happens down here, you can see. But there's an interesting thing that happens when allostasis is at work. And this is what the amazing thing that the brain does. The brain says, I have knowledge about the conditions of things that come my way. They are the variables. So something comes in, some information. I sense it. I know that I have to deal with this because it's an adverse event. So my whole system responds with an acute stress response. That's the effector. And it tries to get rid of this problem. But while it does that, it actually uses prior knowledge which predicts what's going to happen. There's a prediction that says, I predict that if I respond to a particular outcome in this way, I will overcome it easier. So what is the best example of a prediction here that enhances the capacity of this system to overcome things easier, to make this effector stronger? It's optimism, right? So if I'm optimistic about life and in general and about how I'm going to overcome an adverse event, I believe I can see it happening. This predictor says your effector doesn't have to work that hard. In fact, you can even just give it a nice, easy shot, and it's going to control it anyway. And so you don't go into this chronic stress state and implode. So this is an example of how knowledge becomes a strong, it drives prediction, and your prediction drives this whole process into a relaxed physiological state, and you need less of a load, which is called the allostatic load. And the load of this load starts to implode you in time. It just becomes heavier and heavier and heavier, and it erodes you. So if you think about this, learning, understanding how to overcome problems, having a sense of how to actually overcome this predictably, plays an incredibly important role in this allostasis to ensure that I'm resilient. And can you see this? Can you see that complex problem solving, the capacity to solve a problem, to look at a problem and quickly be able to innovate, solve the problem, overcome it, and get back to the status quo, or to be innovative and solve problems even for the future that looks a bit like this, can actually get you move you into reduce the load of this process and enhance your resilience capacity. I hope everybody can see how that enhances resilience and ensure that you do not implode. And so there's already an example of how resilience and complex problem solving actually work together. They affect each other, and they are both extremely important. So you can't just tell somebody we have to be resilient. Resilience requires you have to be resilient, but also you have to look after a number of dimensions to enhance resilience. And one of them is complex problem solving or innovation. I'm going to show those two differ as well. So homeostasis aims to maintain a set point of bodily functions, where allostasis aims to maintain a set point in changing environments. It means that as we change, we understand our system needs to continuously adapt. And because it learns about the conditions, it predicts the future, it adapts accordingly. That adaptive response is incredibly important, and that's what we evolved into. So our ancestors gave rise to us because of that capacity. And now in an incredibly rapidly evolving world that's evolving way, way quicker than ever before, it is just changing incredibly fast. We need to be more and more adaptive and understand, and that's why adaptive and agility is so important for resilience. Right, so another little dimension that I just mentioned. So let me talk about complex problem solving then. You're very welcome to ask your questions in the meantime, or at least by comments in the chat box. Please don't do it in the Q&A, but do it in the chat room where you chat, and I'll respond to them once I've completed this little talk. I'm pretty much there, but let me just talk about complex problem solving. So these clever academics define problem solving as successfully searching for an operation of, or a series of operations in order to transfer the given actual state of the system to a goal state. Now, my goodness, how complex can you make complex problem solving? I mean, this is a crazy definition. But basically what you say is that we are looking for a particular way, a realistic scenario of the possible. We're looking for a particular way to take this current state into something that is more ideal. That's it. And that's a problem solving, right? We've got a problem, let's solve it, let's get it to a better condition, and that's it. Right, so it's a very complex way of just saying something very, I would say, simple. And if you look at this idea of complex problem solving versus innovation, that's very interesting. So I think that this is one of the best ways that you can look at problem solving. This is also not original, but I'm just going to give you read this to you. Problem solving is more about reacting to a specific situation. So effectively, you've got a status quo. You've got to actually get back to a status quo, which is more ideal, remove the problem, and that's problem solving. It requires the same capacity in the brain, the same process, the same problem solving machine solves problems, but also are innovative. And let me explain it. So in contrast, they say innovation is about being proactive. So you can predict. Back to the allostasis, remember the prediction. You've got knowledge, you predict. You can predict, you can focus on new opportunities, improving the performance, raising the bar, all those terms, and breaking through the status quo. So you build through prediction, you can actually build a better scenario, which is not just takes you back to where you are, where you were, which is a good state, but actually take you into a better space. Resilience, it rings a bell, right? The idea of growing to a new strength and a new capacity and a new state in which you can be even more resilient. So can you see there's such a dance between these two terms? And so innovation and problem solving is the same brain, the problem solving machine, same machine, do both of these, or does both of these important things. It innovates and it solves complex problems. If you want to look at the way that the brain needs to be optimized, the brain-body system, the same machinery needs to be optimized. So in a sense, I'm going to try to convince you that if we look at innovation capacity, we say a lot about the capacity for complex problem solving. And so that's what I'm going to show you we've done in our Neurozone code study. So I'm going to just show you that a bit later. So complex problem solving and innovation all starts in the brain. Just remind you that it uses the properties of knowledge, which is situated here in the long-term memory sites in these green, pink, and the yellow areas, which also corresponds with our primary sensory areas. And then this part of the brain takes all this information and creates realistic scenarios of the possible through this major superhighway of the brain. And then it comes up with solutions, right? So a solution to the problem, or with a potential solution for the future to build a better future, which is innovation. Innovation is preceded by creativity, which effectively in the neuroscience definition says, creativity which precedes innovation is to solve problems and fashion novel products that are adapted for the group. It promotes the survival. So it thinks forward, it's in the future. Whereas the problem-solving component only solves this problem, which I have now, to take me back to a better status quo. But you can see that that's a little bit of this and a bit of that. You can see it's the same machine that does all that work. And you can see, if you look at the brain, you can just remember how the complex problem-solving machine works by just looking at it. And it all requires this prefrontal regulatory system to work at its best. If you are resilient, this part of the brain works better because you work from a baseline relaxed physiological state where the prefrontal system regulates everything. If you are, your resilience has crumbled, you move into this chronic stress state in a state where the primordial parts of the brain, you remember the amygdalas, they sit like the eyes of the monster in the depth of the brain, where they take over and they override the effects of this prefrontal system. So your complex problem-solving capacity, your innovative capacity is greatly reduced, significantly reduced by a lack of resilience. And so you need this for complex problem solving. Once again, you can see that they are very much interrelated. And I'm even going to show you just now for just a few seconds, a number of, actually just two articles that has been done to demonstrate how resilience and, well, psychological resilience that we refer to, resilience and the high performance are linked. So here we are with psychological resilience and thriving in high achievers, starting to 2014, demonstrated how these high performers, this was in sport, exercise, and performance psychology, and revealed that there are 6 themes that characterize resilience and thriving. Positive and proactive personality, remember that. Experience and learning, a sense of control, flexibility and adaptability, balance and perspective, and perceived social support. So this speaks a lot about mindset. Perceived social report speaks a lot about the sense of belonging, a sense of making a meaningful contribution, and experience and learning, the learning techniques, and proactive and a positive personality. Once again, somebody with grit, tenacity, making things happen, but optimism, right? Very important here. So you can see that these are, once again, I just want to say that this is a very small study, 13 high achievers, 9 male, 4 female. I'm going to show you what we did with our code, which I think is just incredible, looking at the numbers that we've run with our leaders. But this has been a study that has been published. Here's another study that was published by very much the same 2 authors. They developed this program called the Mental Fortitude Training Program. Now, mental fortitude is what is called training resilience. So if you want to build resilience, you have fortitude programs. So for you listening or in the masterclass, you might want to just Google, if you want to look at ways to build resilience, Google mental fortitude training, and you'll find these programs that have been published, and you can use them. In fact, this mental fortitude program that has been used, basically what they do is they build proactive and reactive resilience. They call it proactive resilience is robust and rebound resilience. So this is reactive to the problem. Proactive speaks more to innovation, and reactive more to complex problem solving. Quite an interesting way that this has been described. And this program focuses on personal qualities, your facilitate the environment, and challenging the mindset. So you can see it speaks to those components which these authors have defined, and they defined in the study. And then they started to develop a program, and they looked at the effects of the program, the efficiency, with great effect. So that's an interesting. You might want to just look at these this particular article if you are interested. So how can we then take this? So what we have said is, we said, look, this is resilience. We defined it from a brain-body system perspective. We defined it from a physiological perspective. We understand resilience from this perspective. We've defined complex problem solving. We looked at innovation, the differences and the similarities. And we said these are all connected. They all affect each other. We looked at allostasis as a very important underlying psychological, physiological premise that shows how these are all interrelated. This is the talk about the dance. It's the way it's all connected. And then we say the brain-body system, everything affects everything. And there's no good reason why we say that, right? Because they are all are affecting each other. And if you look at the Neurozone system, the model and the code, how can you use that to actually learn more about resilience and complex problem solving? And this is the final bit of my my class for you, if I may, and then we're going to have some discussion. It is how can we use the model and the code to really learn something about what are the behaviors that are really important for both these two important outcomes, resilience and complex problem solving. And so we took innovative capacity and ran our studies around innovation capacity, which I argue is very similar to complex problem solving, as I've explained to you, and I hope I made my case convincingly to you. So let's look at just for a moment, take a look at the model of brain performance again. So the Neurozone model of brain performance says there are three major driver systems. It's the most basic and the foundational drivers, which are the wellness, which speaks to wellness rhythms. These are the exercise, movement, nutrition, sleep, wake cycle, silence of the mind, mindfulness training. There's the emotional backbone of social safety, the goal-directed state to achieve goals unconsciously, and then the collective creativity to do it together. And of course, we do that because it gives us a higher yield for the energy that we put in. Otherwise, we would have most likely not done that, right? And then finally, there's this problem-solving machine that we just spoke to. The capacity for using knowledge through learning and using those building blocks, and through an incredibly important process in the superhighway of the brain called a generic parts technique, a process where we take all these components of knowledge and piecemeal it together and crystallizes this into a realistic scenario of the possible, which is the problem being solved. That's the process that takes place here. So you can see this is the model. If you look at the model again, there it is very quickly. You can see that's the foundational in the green that I just spoke to. There's the emotional, and that's complex problem solving machine. So you can actually see that it all makes sense, and they're all interlinked. And they together build resilience, and that we showed, I think, already in our thinking from a very basic perspective, self-leadership, learning capacity, innovation capacity. And let me just show how these behaviors now work. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to take another step, a next stage development, if you think about Neurozone. Remember that you use the 4 core report, which speaks to personal mastery of these 4 core capacities. And the whole report is a great interactive online report, and it is really very valuable for personal mastery of those 4 core capacities and to optimize the brain-body system. But what you can also do is you can take any outcome and you can take every single subdriver, these behaviors underneath. For example, under exercise, there's high intensity interval training as an example, intermittent fasting under nutrition, duration of sleep in the sleep-wake cycle, daytime consistency, etc., etc. And so you can continue, bonding and belonging and so on, a sense of making a meaningful contribution to enhance our sense of belonging in the workplace, in life in general. So you can see how these things, you can take all these behaviors, and I think there are about 68 of them, and you just pivot them in a great, look at through regression analysis, you pivot them around an outcome and see which of these behaviors really correlates best with your particular outcomes. And here is an example. It's very small, but it's not meant for us to look at everything and see it, but you can see how we've just taken all of these behaviors and just pivoted around resilience, and we showed which of these behaviors within a certain cohort gives us the best correlation. They are associated best with resilience. As resilience goes up, this one goes up, and so on. And the correlation between these down here are the weakest. Right. And so we call this the behavioral code for brain performance, or high performance. Whereas the previous one is the model of brain performance, and we have the 4 core report system. We now have analytics that actually just say, let's just look at how all of this just correspond, and then we provide a certain amount of behaviors regardless of which driver they are, and just show how they actually relate to this particular outcome we're looking for. And then we can work on those, the biggest ones, right? Because we just take these and say, hey, low energy, high yield, let's work on these and enhance resilience. Let's work on these and enhance innovation capacity, for example. And if you run these, you find a very interesting pattern, and they're not exactly the same. That's very fascinating, right? So you don't find the same pattern in each of, if you compare it with a specific different type of outcome. So what we did is, I told the analytics team probably about 6 months ago, said, listen, run this for us. Let's run it. We chose 2,500 leaders in our system. They were mostly leaders between 35 and 50. Some of them were younger, as you can see, they are Generation Z and millennials, in South Africa and in the US, mostly. There were some in Europe and Scandinavia and a few in Australia, but this was mostly South African and the US. And we said, run this and look at a number of outcomes, but look at resilience and which behaviors pivot around resilience and which behaviors pivot around innovation capacity. And let's look at that and see, and then look at, for me, and then when we look at the dance of how you can enhance resilience for innovation capacity, which are those that actually are come out top on both sides. So you can actually use them to enhance both of these entities. Just a few notes on this particular group. 2,500 leaders, about a third were women and 2/3 men. The interesting is that some of the just features of this group is that when it comes to resilience and clinic visits and so on, people who are not very well, the health vulnerability, the job level, interns were at a high risk of low resilience and having many clinic visits. Interesting. Less than high school, big problem. Department IT. So these were the most vulnerable. It was an intern who had an education less than high school. Also in the department IT, the resilience was low. Company industry, in wholesale, resilience was lowest. Clinic visits, telecommunications was the highest. The clinic visits, and the Generation Z were at the intern Generation Z were the most vulnerable of them all. This is actually quite important, right? Because our young people in our organizations are the most vulnerable when it comes to resilience and the amount of clinic visits that they have because of that. Right, everybody happy with this interesting finding. When it comes to turnover intentions, if I say leaders, these were high potential people, right? These were not the top leaders in the business, but these are very young, high potential leaders as well. So this is a very important finding, that our young leaders are actually at this risk. Turnover intentions, people who say, yeah, I want to leave the job, my job. Senior managers, presidents, these are the interesting, and vice presidents. But interesting that the age of millennials. So I'm not exactly sure how this finding correlates, but this is what it demonstrated to us. Education, PhD, department IT, transport. So it might be very highly qualified in high positions millennials, right? Once again, they are at high risk, low resilience, turnover intention high. Are they really resilient for this particular job that you give them? Right, so that's very interesting. Just a few of that. Furthermore, the strongest and the most vulnerable departments across 16 industries. When it comes to resilience, I just want to show you resilience there. The best was human resources, interesting. They were the highest, human resources had the highest resilience, and the highest innovation capacity was research and development. Right, where finance were the worst, interesting. And staff turnover intentions, the best marketing and sales, they stayed. The worst were IT, they wanted to leave. And so on and so forth. So I'm not going to go into everything, but you can see that for that 2,500 people, there were interesting findings. This is what I want to show you. These 6 behaviors are the 6 behaviors which came up tops when you look at resilience and innovation capacity combined. Optimism. Remember that study that was done? Talked about your positive outlook and a positive personality. Making a sense of making a meaningful contribution in work life. That speaks to social safety. It is arguably the most important component of social safety that you and I need, that makes us socially safe. It gives us a right to belong. because we are working at the moment and we are paying back to the world because we were educated and we have competencies and skills that we have to use. So it's important for us to be able to have a sense of making a meaningful contribution to work life. Curiosity. This builds, and then the generic parts technique. This is the capacity, it's a technique that enables us to solve our problems better. It enhances our problem-solving capacity by taking anything that you see, any problem, and breaking it up in its finite generic parts, and then allow your brain unconsciously to work with the generic parts and to see something different, see something new, so it can actually put it all together and then make a realistic scenario that's possible. Learning techniques, interesting, very interesting. Once again, it speaks to knowledge, to learning, to be able of actually having more and more knowledge, which, remember, in allostasis is so important because now you can make better predictions. So these are important components of problem solving. This is extremely important for problem solving, isn't it? It's hugely important to learn more, to have more information so that you can solve problems. And then reducing negative thought patterns. This is not the same as optimism. It's something you don't do, right? Which is to reduce negative thought patterns in the teams and organizations. Optimism, curiosity, and reducing negative thought patterns speak to the goal-directed system. So goal-directedness is very well, as a driver, is well represented here. Meaning in work life speaks to social safety. Generic parts technique speaks to abstraction, the capacity for problem solving, and the learning technique speaks to learning. So very interesting spread between the emotional drivers and the complex problem solving drivers when you think about resilience and innovation capacity. And this is the findings of 2,500 people. What is quite interesting is that the wellness rhythms that the foundational drivers need to deliver have not featured as strongly as these. It doesn't mean that they don't play a part. They are important, but this is extremely important when you look at the way that this correlates with the findings of our own system. And with that, I'm going to hand over to you, and I'm going to stop sharing, and I'm going to look at the chats. Oh, hello, Leo. Good to hear from you. And then Steve, it's great to hear from you from the US. It must be very cold in Montana. How does one take memory of the knowledge of a past adverse event with a colleague and reframe it in order to predict a better, more effective action going forward? I wouldn't have expected anything less from you, Steve, because I know you and respect you so much as an incredible coach. For me, this question is a transformative question as opposed to transactional. How do we transform that particular knowledge of a past adverse event? For me, I think just as I'm not a psychologist, but as what I would probably now call a integrated behavioral neuroscientist at Neurozone, I think it's very important to understand mindset very well. And of course, you are an expert in mindset, but maybe just my perspective from a neuroscientific perspective on mindset. The values that we assign to incoming cues, which are so important, which effectively drives our unconscious behavior and then drives our actions unconsciously, which often makes feelings and thoughts a bystander, an observer, especially when these past events are really of a very significant emotional, traumatic nature. I think the knowledge of the innate needs, the innate driver systems of a need for belonging and bonding, the way the goal-directed system works, and how we use dopamine and serotonin for reward and for a sense of well-being, how we work with self-worth, how those components work together, and how this becomes a template, basically that ranges from a very high value that we assign to certain things to the lowest value, if you may. In that space, bonding and belonging plays extremely a strong role. I think that understanding enables us to then redefine and reframe the value that we assign to incoming cues. And I suppose any adverse event, if I had to take a shot at that, I would take an adverse event and I would look at the drivers of basically staying alive, surviving, thriving life, and say, how do these drivers work on this particular adverse event? Can I actually provide the generic parts of this value assignment, and then solve the problem of moving you, transforming you by a reassigning of certain values, by providing the insights and understanding of what drives us. I am not sure that I'm making sense, Steve, but that would be my thought. Peter, this concur with last observation. If optimism influences prediction, then the question, if pessimism is there, what are the sabotaging elements for breakdown and implosion? Very important question, Peter. I think, so we've seen a number of those. We haven't run the numbers on our big cohorts, which will be very interesting to do. But negative intrusive thought patterns, as we know, if you don't remove them, have a very significant negative effect on resilience. Also, especially on problem solving, but on both. It's actually in the top 5 in both of these two particular very important codes, if you may. So this negative thought patterns that come from pessimism within an organization erodes resilience and erodes problem solving greatly. So I think that's probably saying enough of that. And of course, there are others as well. A lack of belonging, a lack of bonding. These are negative components that actually changes our behavior. And to that point, there needs to be some transformation, I suppose, to this transaction. Yeah, I think that's probably the best way to explain that from what we saw in the code. Question from Anne. Anne, can Etienne go the generic parts technique again? Right, just very quickly. So the generic parts technique, I'll give you an example of a generic parts technique. If you take 2 rings, this has been studied. If you look at the study, you can just go and just Google it. You'll see that this is what they explain in the study that has been done. Great study, 67% improvement on problem solving if you use the generic parts technique. For example, if I give you 2 rings, 2 metal rings, and I give you a candle and a match, and I tell you in how many ways can you take these 2 rings and form a figure 8, which means you got to get them together. The first idea we would have is to just burn the wax and then get the wax around it, and have a figure 8. But if you take the generic parts technique, you basically break up every single one of these. If you engineer, you even want to ask what are these rings made of? What kind of metal? Maybe it's lead, and I can actually melt it together. And what about the candle? The candle consists of wax and of a wick, and I can take these apart and I look at the wick as a piece of string. That's interesting, right? And I look at the match with sulfur and the wood. And now I see a piece of string and I see 2 metal rings, and you agree that's a very satisfactory solution if you just take these metal rings and you string it together with this piece of string. So you burn away the wax, keep the wick, and then just take the wick and string it together. How interesting. So that's a generic parts technique at work, a very good example of how you do that. It becomes quite complex if you have complex problems, but it's really worthwhile practicing the generic parts technique, because it helps us to piecemeal all these generic parts together for a better problem solving capacity. Also, chronic stress under high stress, chronic disease. So I assume, Peter, you referred to a high stress means high ongoing stress, which is chronic stress. Remember that there are 3 forms of stress, really, if you want to use that kind of idea. The one is U stress, which is EU stress, is a good stress. That's the kind of stress we go through. I mean, I am stressed while I'm talking to you because I have to perform now, and after this, I'm going to sit down, relax, have a drink, and I'm going to look at the sky, and I'm going to be in a baseline relaxed physiological state. This was U stress. If it was too severe and I was so pumped up, so stressed out, I might have had a blank, and the stress would have caused an anxiety response and a panic attack, and that is called that's distress. And then the chronic stress is the stress where you have this low-grade stress, it's just ongoing, and the cortisol is higher than it should be, and you just have toxins circulating in the system, and the pro-inflammatory state because of that. So chronic disease, if you just have episodes of very high stress that go away, some of these can lead to dysfunction, even cardiovascular events. It has been described, but by far they are not even close as remotely as dangerous and important as chronic stress. I hope that helps a bit. And then Leah, with AI being the driver of our augmented skills, they can problem solve faster as humans. What do we need to do to ensure that resilience is a key element of the future skills? Very, very important to that point. If you look at what we say are the important things, I think the first thing is just to understand that we are not complex computers, and computers are not simple human beings at the moment. Two different things. So complex computers and complex AI systems, the way the data is processed and analyzed when it becomes very complex and big in numbers, that process can become very, very unpredictable, and of course can become extremely intuitive. I'm pretty convinced about that, that is possible. But it will still be a non-biological entity, and you and I are biological entities. So the first thing that I often say today to, when we do leadership development, speak to groups and workshops, the first thing is that we are biological. And being biological means that we cannot just be switched on like computers and we will just burn out in time. So we need to switch on, switch off, have this wellness rhythms, which keeps us well. And then to build resilience ensures that we do not implode as the adverse events come our way. It sets us up for high performance. But it does not necessarily, as we said, cause high performance on its own unless we are really acting towards that by solving problems. And of course, that enhances the resilience again. Back to this question then, is what are the key elements we have to look after? I definitely believe that it's collaboration, and that the collaboration will give us the ultimate, will help us trump whatever AI comes our way, if you may, and still keep us ahead of the curve. But that also requires a number of social safety, being safe together, a number of these characteristics to be in place, and all of that builds resilience. And so resilient people are more capable of actually going through the motions of actually forming a collaborative collective, which is also not without stress. So I think that's just, all of these are important, and everything affects everything. Carlos, can you share more about why the 6 behaviors you listed did not include behaviors related to it? Yeah, Carlos, I mean, incredible. I don't know. I don't know. I mean, this is what the numbers show, right? We've had many thoughts about this. In fact, what we intend to do is categorize numbers to see what is the effect, for example, of exercise on optimism. But I suspect it's gonna show an effect, but it's just not as big. I think what is important is to understand that every single one of these drivers have been shown to enhance resilience, to enhance problem-solving skills, to enhance innovation capacity. But they seemingly are not as important as the code has decided for us. So the code shows that in 2,500 leaders, the number one, the highest correlating behavior or characteristic, if you may, is optimism. And the lowest one, if I remember well, is drinking water. It doesn't mean that drinking water does not enhance the capacity. It is just the lowest correlating one. It's just the one that you're not going to focus on if this is what you want to achieve, right? But it still has an effect. Everything affects everything. So why the foundational drivers? I would have expected that sleep is incredibly important to build resilience. I think this is the way it works. I think that if you have a lack of sleep and you do not exercise properly, and you do not, your nutrition for fuel and for structure is just poor, and your mind is not that silent, it has an effect on optimism, no doubt. And that's where it comes in. But it also, if you don't have that, it leads to disease, not necessarily by crumbling your resilience, but effectively by switching on the inflammatory system. And we know that is true, right? So if you have a lack of sleep, or you take alcohol, and too much alcohol at night, you go into a sympathetic drive without even needing to crumble your resilience. And that sympathetic drive can cause disease without, over time, right, chronically, without even having to break down your resilience. So I don't think that it's necessary then through the resilience crumbling that it causes inflammation and disease. It can actually bypass it and cause disease. This is why it's so important. So we're probably going to start to look at the code as saying these are essentials to just keep you well. These are essentials to build your resilience that keeps you well, but also sets your performance. And these are the ones that enhance performance more preferentially. But we still have to evolve into that process with our code. I hope that makes a bit of sense. I was just thinking on my feature with you, Carlos, but it's a very important question. Thank you. Steve, in what ways can science of the mind be used as a tool to enhance resilience? So to that point, mindfulness training. Mindfulness training, science of the mind daily, 15, 20 minutes a day, it reduces the effect of the amygdalas, and then enhances the regulation of the prefrontal cortex, which in itself sets you up for better problem-solving capacity. Why it wasn't the number one is quite interesting, once again. It is so important. It's also very important to reduce to enhance a baseline relaxed physiological state, to put us in that, to prevent illness, to enhance longevity by means of that, once again, not necessarily through resilience, but by enhancing, just be sure that we are in a baseline relaxed physiological state. As I've explained, not absolutely everything goes through resilience, but yeah, so once again, I think it is important. I think it's been, I think in the code it has been sort of in the mid-20s, so it's not important, it is important. Okay, so having said that, thanks, Steve. I hope that helps a bit. And then, Wayne, how much does collaboration increase complex problem-solving ability and innovation as opposed to operating individually? So this is a huge, a very important, so the whole idea of diversity and collective creativity, very important for complex problem-solving. Once again, it has not been in the top 6, but it has been in the top 20. And so it's important to understand that it is very important. And we, once again, the way that it, how much it does in the top 20, I think that's probably my best answer to you. This is the way, if you look at how the code has been weighted in on this system. So I have certain ideas about what I think is more important when I think hierarchically from foundational to the most sophisticated, by thinking reductionistic as a doctor and as a logical mathematical thinking individual, and I'm sure you too, you think about this and you say, hey, how's this and this and this? I can only say these are the findings. And we will continue to refine the code. We will continue to challenge ourselves. This is all we have at the moment, and it's the best we've got at the moment, but we will continue to be sure that we refine and ensure that we actually find explanations for all of these. Patty, hi Patty, how frequently will you run the analytics track measures? Oh, we do it continuously. So it's continuously running in the background, Patty. All the time that we receive information that we have, so we have continuous users of our system. And I think we are running, they are being run at the moment, but we're also starting to categorize these into sub-drivers, where we call them certain behaviors, and then there are conditions and characteristics, and we're starting to refine this as we start to learn more about the code. But it is done all the time, continuously. What is quite great about this, of course, if you think about it, is that you can effectively develop a code for any cohort of people, right? So if you've got a large company, let's say we have banks and there are 40,000 people in the bank, you run the code, you give them a heat map of where are the needs and the challenges and opportunities, and from the brain-body system perspective, you can effectively use that cohort to develop their own template. That becomes a very individual template to which they want to aspire, and then run the code and use that code as a template, and then optimize the system accordingly, which becomes a very personalized process for the leaders to work with and to ensure that they remain optimized. Or they can actually use templates that are very specific to the different industries, etc., provided we can provide that code in time to the different industries. And that is something that we are currently exploring. And of course, we will deliver that as needed to the different industries. I hope that explains everything. We need to go. We are 5 minutes over the time. My apologies that I've kept you for another 5 minutes. And if these change with a broader sample, yes, totally, Patty. I hope that also explained that question. Please be well. Have a wonderful evening for those of you in South Africa, and for those of you in the US. Have a great day, and hope that the snow don't get you down. It's incredible what's happening in the winter. We don't understand that in South Africa. But all of the best to you, and have a wonderful day. And thanks for everybody for joining. It's such a pleasure. Goodbye.